Thank you. I'm going to start with an act of real estate heresy. You don't have to buy a home. I'm going to repeat that for those of you who are actually expecting a sales pitch today. You don't actually have to buy a home. In fact, there are many good reasons not to buy a home. For example, if you're like many professionals here in Tokyo, you or your spouse may need to relocate to get a new job or to keep the one that you have. You may find that the real estate market is really overpriced like it is in Canada right now, and it makes more sense to rent than it does to buy. Your personal life could be in a state of flux. You could be having children or having in the middle of a divorce. The homes that are for sale might not meet your needs. They may not meet your budget or your tastes. Your prices may be falling, or your reference currency may actually be appreciating, making it more sensible for you to wait and actually spend your money later when you can get more for your buck. Or, like many of us, you may not simply be able to afford the price. And there's nothing in the financial planning rule book that says you have to own property to be happy or really to be successful in the money market. But let's say you've overcome all of those objections and you've decided that you want to buy a house. How do you go about it? Well, let's start with the good news. It's never actually been easier to buy a home in a second country. There's more information available on the internet. There's more transportation options like low-cost airlines to get you in and out of your country and the home in the second country. And more cities and countries are welcoming foreign immigrants, retirees, and investors. Those realities are reflected in the statistics. In 2013, 232 million people lived abroad. That's up from 175 million in 2000 and 154 million in 1990. If you took that 232 million people, it would be the 5th largest country on earth after Indonesia. That's a lot of people. Over 3 million American baby boomers plan to retire abroad, and more than 1 million Britons now live outside the UK, a number that's doubled since 2006. And those numbers don't include the rapidly rising number of Indians and Chinese who are buying outside their home countries. Third, there are a lot of similarities between international housing markets. If you live in Hong Kong and you buy a home in another common law country, like, for example, England, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, many of the legal concepts, ownership structures, and so on, the buying processes are going to be very familiar. Likewise, civil law countries like France, Germany, most of Africa, and most of Latin America, they share similarities as well. And even some hybrid systems, like the one that you find in mainland China and here in Japan, have familiar elements, like, for example, the way that condominiums are treated. That said, though, every real estate market on earth has its idiosyncrasies. Now, some of those idiosyncrasies are really positive surprises. For example, if you go to the United States, you can lock in your financing with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage so that you know what you're going to pay for the next 30 years. And not only that, in the U.S., your interest on your mortgage is actually tax deductible, which is quite unusual. Other idiosyncrasies, on the other hand, come as a rude shock. For example, if you're a non-resident and you buy in Canada, when you sell your home, your lawyer, by law, must withhold 25 to 50% of the sales proceeds until the government is satisfied that you've settled your tax bill. And that can be a real blow if you're planning on using the money for something else. Building standards are another source of surprises. Most of you probably know that asbestos causes lung cancer, and you probably know about lead paint, which causes brain damage. But you may not realize that both asbestos and lead paint are still commonly used in the building trades. Asbestos is used in the United States, which is even more astonishing when you consider how litigious the Americans are. And you can buy lead paint today in more than 40 countries in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Attitudes towards home ownership are another thing that really differs from country to country. In Hong Kong, where I live, a home is seen as a store of wealth and a commodity that can be traded. But in other places, housing is seen as a social good, as a basic human right, and speculators are heavily taxed, and landlords must contend with rent controls and other tenant protection measures. And that can be a real shock if you're looking at this as a business. Those attitudinal differences also extend to new developments. So, for example, if you buy off the plan in London now, you might be shocked to learn that the complex that you're buying in includes social housing for low-income families and other disadvantaged people that are built under what's called Section 106 agreements. And those sort of developments, those joint developments, are quite common in the UK and also increasingly in the United States. In the UK, you'll also find a lot of homes that are built on brownfield sites, which are disused chemical plants, steel mills, and things like that, because that's one of the government's plans to increase the housing stock, is to reuse those old sites. In addition, cities like London and Vancouver are seeing a really big backlash against what they call buy-to-leave owners. And those are people who buy a home and then leave it empty. The critics believe that that is unfair and socially unjust because it prices the rest of this population out of the housing market. I don't know if you're familiar with a show called MIPIN. It's one of the biggest real estate events on earth, and it's actually going on right now in London, and there are big protests going on from people who are upset about the way public housing is being handled there. Local social standards can also have a really profound impact on your ability to enjoy your home. For example, the New York Times recently ran a very glowing profile of a lady named Tamara Robertson, who specializes in serving lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender clients. And that speaks a lot to the New York market. If you go, for example, to a place like Nigeria, the penalty for homosexuality is death by stoning. So it's a very, very different market. A little bit closer to home, if you go to Malaysia, the 1975 movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail is still banned there. You can't watch it legally. So there are a lot of different regional variations. Fourth, housing markets are not homogenous. There are economic, customary, and legal variations at the state or province, city and county, and even neighborhood level. So for example, if you take Louisiana and Quebec, those are both civil law jurisdictions that exist in common law countries. And it also applies to a market's attractiveness as an investment. So for example, single-family homes are not the same as condos. New condos are not the same as old condos, particularly in places like Vancouver and New Zealand, which are plagued with a lot of leaky condos. And residential, industrial, and commercial property are all very distinct markets that are shaped by different economic factors and political factors too. And that's important because people selling international real estate will often make blanket statements like, now is a really good time to buy Paris. And parts of the market may in fact be a superb investment, but other sectors might be overbuilt, overpriced, or headed for a large correction. So if somebody tells you now is a great time to buy in a country, ask what specific part of the market they're talking about and why it's compelling. And while you're at it, ask them where they got their numbers from. Not all data sources are credible. Some of the numbers may be cooked up by somebody's marketing department, packaged by a trade body, or tweaked by bureaucrats. China is infamous for that. Speaking of sectors and subsectors, be very, very careful buying recreational property, especially when you're feeling mellow after a really good vacation. The people who sell these properties are very familiar with this weakness in human character, and you're nice and relaxed, and you look over at your girlfriend or your wife or your husband, and you say, gee, wouldn't it be nice to own a little piece of this? It would be, but the problem is that vacation homes and recreational properties are typical discretionary spending. And when times get tough, the value of these places tends to drop and the market becomes very illiquid. To give you an example close to home, when Lehman Brothers went bust in 2008, the values of properties in Australia's Gold Coast dropped about 50% pretty much overnight, and they're only now starting to recover. Fifth, when you buy across international borders, you're exposed to geopolitical risk. If you go back to 2008, for example, the protests in Bangkok closed down both of that city's airports and stranded a whole lot of tourists for weeks on end. Right now, my home, Hong Kong, is being rocked by protests as well. And those protests can have a profound impact on the value of your property and also the liquidity, your ability to sell it if you want to get out of the market. At the same time, though, protests and things like that and crises can really represent a great opportunity if you're looking to the long term and you're not afraid of taking on a little bit of risk. Diplomatic spats between countries, like the one that erupted between Canada and the United Arab Emirates in 2010, can also interfere with your ability to enjoy your property. At the height of the dispute, Canadians visiting the UAE were charged 1,000 Canadian dollars for a visa to get in. That's roughly about 1,000 Australian dollars. More recently, Russians who bought apartments in New York City and Chinese factory owners in Vietnam have been paying very, very close attention to the news headlines. There's nothing like the sound of gunshots to make you realize just how immobile and how illiquid real estate can be. Sixth, demography is destiny, and demographics create opportunities. For example, in the US and Canada right now, baby boomers, people born between 1946 and 1964, have got a large proportion of their wealth tied up in their homes, and they plan on selling those homes and downscaling to finance their retirement. But there are far fewer people in the succeeding cohort. As a matter of fact, there's about 10 million fewer people in that succeeding cohort. And as those baby boomers downsize, there's going to be a glut of single-family homes. And the people who would be buying them have seen their parents get burned. And many of them have actually been burdened with really, really crappy jobs and very high levels of student loan debt. You may not realize this, but in the United States, if you declare personal bankruptcy, you can get out from under a car loan, you can get out from under a mortgage in many places, but you can't get out from under your student loans. It follows you around forever. And right now, there's 1.2 trillion US dollars in outstanding student loans in the US. About 10+% of those are either delinquent or over 90 days late. So there's a big, big issue that's coming with that if you're investing in the United States in residential real estate, you're going to want to be aware of. Demographics also provide some interesting opportunities. In rich countries with aging population, there's great demand for recreational properties that include things like golf courses and tennis courts. I would be less inclined to invest in things like ski hills and rock climbing facilities because 80-year-olds generally don't engage in those sports. Similarly, nations with plenty of young people who will be tomorrow's doctors and nurses and medical aides make for really desirable retirement destinations. To give you some numbers, in 2012, just 4% of the people in the Philippines and 5% of those in Indonesia were aged over 65, both very, very young populations. Contrast that with Spain and Portugal, where seniors represent 19 and 18% of the population, respectively. You're looking at a demographic time bomb there, not unlike the one you're facing here in Japan. Unlike geopolitical threats, demographic trends tend to unfold slowly. So they're things that are fairly easy to research and to get your head around if you're looking at buying. 7, solid interpersonal skills are absolutely essential when you buy abroad. In addition to an agent, a lawyer, and a banker, you're going to be depending on people to help you with gardening, collecting rent, paying bills, filing taxes, and a variety of other activities. So friends or family who bought a home in a city or country can be a great source of information and intelligence and introductions. Reviews and comments on social media can also be a big help. But at the end of the day, you are still going to have to overcome cultural and linguistic barriers, and more importantly, you're going to have to try and figure out who's smart, who's competent, and who's trustworthy. And that's a challenge. You'll also need the ability to build rapport to overcome problems. And that includes knowing when to push an issue, like for example, a contractor who's done substandard work, and when to just shut up and accept it. Speaking from experience, hard-won experience, it's easy for tempers to fray and for disputes to escalate to the point where lawyers are involved or worse. In Hong Kong and in China, it's not unusual for contractors who haven't been paid to actually kidnap people's children. It's a rough town. 8, everything takes longer overseas, and everything costs twice as much and is twice as frustrating as it would be at home. Time zones, public holidays, labor regulations, differing work ethics, and even distance make simple things complex. And that's particularly true if you're coming from a developed country like Japan or a small, hyper-effective, efficient country like Hong Kong or Singapore, where things just work and everything just sort of ticks over. And you're going to a more relaxed place like Thailand. You have to put a different set of thinking tools to work there. To put that into more specific perspective, in New Zealand you can re-register a property in exactly 1 day. If you go to the island of Kiribati, it takes an average of 513 days. Haiti is about 300. So with that in mind, you want to ask yourself, how much time do you want to devote to buying and running a home, managing a renovation project, or custom building a house? Some people get right into it and find it's very therapeutic and a really engaging process. For other people, though, renting is easier and is less stressful. And you really have to know yourself, and you have to think about what your goals are to get a handle on that. 9, international borders complicate financial matters. It's difficult to get a mortgage if you don't reside or have a credit history in the country where your home is located. If a mortgage is available, the terms are usually worse than they would be for a local customer. You'll get a shorter loan tenor, a lower loan-to-value ratio, and you'll generally pay a higher interest rate. Citizens of the United States are particularly disadvantaged at this point because of the Foreign Account Tax Compliant Acts, or FATCA. Many foreign banks now are quite reluctant to lend to American clients because the cost of complying with the American government's reporting requirements are just make the whole process difficult and just unpleasant for the banks. So if you're an American, it can be difficult to get a mortgage. As a result of many of these hassles, many international buyers just pay cash. And cash is good because it lets you complete your purchase quickly with fewer contingencies in your offer. And if you're buying in a hot market, that lack of contingencies can make your offer more attractive than one that's actually larger in dollar terms. If you do pay cash, though, you'll need to make sure that you obey all of the capital controls in the country of origin and destination, or you may not be able to repatriate your proceeds when you sell your home. Income, capital gains, sales, and property taxes are complex in their own right. When you put an international border into the mix, they become even more complicated. So it's wise to get expert advice before you commit to a course of action. Insurance can provide a lot of peace of mind, particularly when there's distance between where you live and where your home is located. And many insurance products like fire insurance, homeowners, and public liability cover are very similar from one country to the next. But that's not true of all kinds of cover. For example, earthquake insurance was only recently been made available throughout Italy. In Turkey, on the other hand, you can't get the utilities to your home connected unless you can prove that you've got earthquake insurance. Here in Japan, it's sold as a rider to your fire insurance policy. So there are differences from country to country. And that brings me to my last point, which is that research is really the key to success. Fortunately, there are new and increasingly powerful tools that make it easier than ever to investigate countries, cities, neighborhoods, and even individual suppliers. For example, if you're shopping for a new city, the International Standards Organization recently published something called ISO 37120, which is a benchmark for sustainable development that measures urban cities and quality of life. Today, about 15 different cities, including London, Rotterdam, Shanghai, Dubai, Chicago, Johannesburg, and Buenos Aires, have adopted this ISO standard, and it lets you compare international metropolitan areas using 46 different metrics, ranging from things like traffic noise to urban density. You can also consult the Urban Observatory, which uses interactive maps to compare about 50 cities around the world on things like flood zones. And there's more and more information like that, new stuff that's being packaged in new ways with interactive maps, but also old things like fire insurance maps in the United States, where you can actually see how a neighborhood has changed, or maps of interactive maps of London that show where bombs were dropped during the Second World War. So you can really get a sense for what a neighborhood is like, how it's changed, and for that matter, what sort of facilities were there. You may know the expression "mad as a hatter." That comes from hatters using mercury to treat felt to make hats with. You can actually see where the factories where they made felt hats were in downtown London, and you can avoid mercury poisoning that way. What's even more interesting, though, is how big data is being used to provide real-time information. So, for example, in the Netherlands, there are transit maps that show you the location of trains and buses from 7 different countries in real time on the internet. In Helsinki, you can see the location of snowplows and real-time data for traffic noise. So all of these things allow you to get really very deep levels of information about the city or the neighborhood that you're going to move into. From crime statistics to income and education levels, there are literally hundreds of different ways that the internet is providing new insights and empowering you as an individual buyer. So to recap, you don't need to buy a home abroad. You can achieve many of the benefits and eliminate a lot of the headaches by renting instead. But if you do decide to buy, you're actually joining a growing international club, and it's easier than it's ever been. Third, there are a lot of similarities between international housing markets, but watch out for the quirks that define each market. And remember that each country and city comprises hundreds of sectors and subsectors, and each one of those subsectors has got its quirks and its differences in its drivers of value and price. Fifth, consider how vulnerable your new home is to geopolitical risk. As the French philosopher Auguste Comte noted, demography is destiny. And without people, there's no real estate market. It really does help to understand the demographic trends. Seventh, buying abroad makes you dependent on other people, and your people skills can make the difference between a successful purchase and an unmitigated disaster. Eighth, where international borders are involved, everything takes twice as long, is twice as expensive, and is twice as frustrating. But if your expectations are realistic, you can take all of this in your stride, and you can make a success of it. 9, money laundering legislation, capital controls, international tax law, and so on can add a great deal of complexity to your purchase. You want to address these issues before you buy, rather than trying to put the toothpaste back into the tube later on. Finally, the internet and big data empower buyers in new and exciting ways. To take advantage of much, you really should take advantage of this information. Most of it is available free of charge online, and it'll make your life a lot easier. And finally, if you do the research before you set sail, an international home ownership can be a rich and a rewarding experience. Thank you.